Tonight's meeting is going to talk about DART as a whole, but also we're going to try to focus on transportation issues in Johnston, Grimes, and Urbandale. So of course your feedback about the whole DART network is important, but we did try to set up individual public meetings so that we could really get into some of the issues and get into some of the details like George was sharing about his specific commute and how the routes could better serve him. And so that's just the kind of feedback and information that we're looking for. So I appreciate that. I do have about 20, maybe even 30 minutes of slides. I promise that it moves pretty quickly and we will stop a couple different times to ask questions. But really throughout the presentation, you should feel free to put questions in the chat is a really easy way to do it. Or otherwise even just pause me. There's not a lot of us on the call, so it's fine for us to just have an informal conversation, but also we will stop to ask and answer any questions. As I mentioned, the purpose of this meeting is so that we can provide information to you about our planning study, but also so that you can provide information to us. And one of the key ways that we're collecting information is via our survey. You can find the survey on the project website, which is ridedart.com/plan. There's a link there, and I bet Rachel's putting it in the chat for you to see. This is really important because that's our way of collecting really detailed feedback. We ask some questions. I think it should only take you about 10 minutes to fill it out, but it allows us to get some really detailed feedback about where we might, how we can improve our services. That survey is available online. We also have print versions available at the local libraries. Just some really quick logistics. If you could try to stay muted so we don't have too many dogs barking and kids asking for Cheerios, although mine may come in and do that, but I apologize ahead of time. As I mentioned, comments and questions are welcome in the chat at any time. We'll have some two pauses where we will answer those, or as I see them come in, I'll try to answer them. And then of course, share your feedback and learn more at ridedart.com/plan. And there's some pictures there if you're not sure how to mute yourself or how to hit the chat. So for those who are less familiar with DART, I did want to highlight that, we really have three main categories of services that we provide. What we call fixed route, which is the big buses that travel on a set schedule and a set time on a set route. Those carry the majority of our passengers. That's maybe what we're most known for. But we also have a rideshare service, which is a van pooling service that helps long distance commuters with that have usually a shared work destination get to work more efficiently. And then we also have our paratransit service, which is a door-to-door service that's offered for people with disabilities. The main reason that people do ride DART is to get to work. And we know that because from the frequent surveys that we do. We also know that people use DART for shopping, for medical purposes, to get to education, for a lot of different reasons. But really, when you think about DART and we think about transportation in general, it's really about getting people where they need to go. That's how we drive our economy and how we improve people's lives. This is a map of our bus service area. You can see that we cover 12 member communities throughout central Iowa. Tonight I mentioned we are going to focus on kind of our northwest member communities in Grimes, Johnston, and Urbandale. But I'm happy to take any feedback about bus service and transit service in any of our member communities. Tonight we'll get into a little bit about our strategy for planning bus routes, about some of the destinations that we try to serve, and some key challenges that we're trying to address for the region. We've conducted surveys before, and we actually get requests from customers fairly frequently. And we know that people are trying to get to where they need to go quicker, either by having shorter travel times or more frequency in between buses. They like to see additional areas covered by transit, and then maybe some additional service on weekends or later in the evening. And also, people will often request improvements at bus stops. These are some broad categories and trends that we do here. Our most recent kind of big planning effort was in 2016, where a lot of these findings are from. But it's important for us to refresh this periodically so that we make sure that we're understanding what the priorities of our customers are, and also so that we can get really detailed feedback about how we can improve specific routes or reach certain destinations. Because as we know, our lives evolve and the region evolves. This is a list, and this is a long list, but it's actually not even a full list of all the changes that we've made over the last just about 2 or 3 years in response to some of this feedback. As I mentioned before, getting people to work is the number one reason that people ride DART. And so reaching more work destinations has been a focus of ours. And listed here are a few of the endeavors that we've been able to undertake in order to reach more job sites, like when the Hy-Vee commissary opened in Ankeny, when the Amazon facility opened in Bondurant, and then some other routes that we knew were important to get people across the region. In particular, I'll draw your attention to this loop up here. So in 2019, we actually extended this Route 93 up further into Johnston and around through Grimes. And that was in response to some of the feedback that we got. And we did see a positive response from ridership to that change. And so that's one thing to draw your attention to. And the other thing I'll draw your attention to is the purple square there that covers a fair portion of Urbandale. And that is our Flex Connect pilot. That's a partnership with Uber and Yellow Cab that I'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation, where we've been able to try something new and different in order to help people have more access to transit. In addition to those service enhancements, we've also been thinking a lot about our technology and our vehicles. We've upgraded all the fare boxes on all of our buses so that it's easier for customers to pay. And we've also added additional payment options. Even you can pay with your mobile phone through our MyDart app. You can also plan your trip through the MyDart app or through our website. And we've also been investing in electric vehicles. We have a pilot of 7 electric vehicles that are helping us understand whether we can not only run cleaner, but also potentially save on life cycle costs with this new technology. And then similarly, we are purchasing more smaller buses. That's actually a smaller, it's 30 feet long instead of the normal 40 feet long picture in the upper right, because not all of our routes always have a full bus. And so we recognize that we can save a little bit on the upfront cost of the vehicle and get a little bit better gas mileage with a smaller vehicle. And so we're also purchasing some of those smaller vehicles. When we think about the future, there's a couple of key trends that we think about that we know are going to be challenges and that we want to try to address. The first is that our region is growing. By some accounts, we could grow to as much as 1 million people in about 20 years. Not all of that growth is happening, or actually I should say that growth is spread out all over our region. Much of it is happening as our region grows geographically, where it's spreading out farther and farther, which can be a challenge for transit. Whenever things aren't built near an existing bus line, then there needs to be a decision made as to, do you expand bus service or how do you serve a mobility need there? And then also, of course, we operate under financial constraints. DART's main source of funding is property taxes. Of course, we do receive federal and state funding as well, but local property taxes are the primary funding source. And so when we think about how do we meet the growing needs of the region, how do we meet the evolving needs of the region, we also want to make sure that we're being responsible with the tax dollars we do receive, and that we're even thinking about ways that we can be innovative and maybe attract additional revenue for DART. The transportation industry itself is evolving. We know that more and more people are seeking out active forms of transportation as ways of staying healthy, but also technology is evolving. There is more opportunities for shared rides, such as like with Uber or Lyft or car sharing and scooter sharing in some communities. We know that the bus is going to continue to be a primary source of public transit, but we also want to think about how we can start to mix in some of these additional mobility options so that we can meet different needs in the community. And I'll get into what some of those could be. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're looking to the future and trying to plan for the transportation needs. The planning study that we are embarking on is really seeking to optimize our existing transit service. How can we do the most with the resources that we already have and build on what we have? We also want to make sure that we're responding to our evolving transportation needs, which we'll talk about tonight, and that we'll want to try to take advantage of some of the innovations in mobility and transportation. This is an overview of the timeline for the study. We've been conducting existing conditions analysis, and I'll share some of that briefly with you tonight. But right now, we're really focusing on public input. We're having a number of meetings just like this. Right now, that we're all virtual, but later on, towards the end of summer, we'll come back and we'll have more in-person opportunities. So we're going to use this input that we get tonight in our survey and in our other public meetings, and we're going to draft some recommendations about how we can improve on DART. And we'll come back for public input at the end of summer and into fall, with the goal of drafting a plan by the end of the calendar year. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some existing conditions. We've been looking at data of DART ridership, land use, and other things, and I want to share a little bit about what we see as the opportunities and challenges, and then we're gonna discuss a little bit as a group. So first off, I want to point out that when we plan our routes, not all routes look the same. We really try to tailor the bus routes to the needs of the region and the needs of our customers. And so we do that by setting up a couple of different categories of bus routes. Some routes really, they operate 7 days a week, and they have the most frequency. These routes operate about every 20 minutes for most of the day. Those routes are mostly on, or they're all on busy corridors with lots of destinations. So we invest the most service in the places that have the most ridership and the most potential for ridership. That's our way of trying to be responsible with resources that we have. However, we also know that there's lots of needs in the community. And so we try to match those areas that might have a less demand for transit by having less service. So maybe we focus service only on the weekdays or only on certain times of the day. And those we call coverage routes. Then we have express routes, which are really focusing on serving commuters, longer distance commuters going in and out of downtown Des Moines. And those routes utilize the freeway. They have less frequent bus stops. They have park and rides. So really those are designed to serve those long distance commuter needs. And then lastly, we have on-call shuttle routes. These are, this is a door-to-door service, so it's not run on a schedule, but it's ordered ahead of time, usually for shorter trips, usually designed around helping people run errands, not typically commute options as they're currently designed. This is a map of our service area and ridership. So the bigger the blue dot is, the more ridership. So you can see a lot of the ridership, concentrates in and around Des Moines. As I mentioned before, routes that have the most service on them, that serve major destinations, those are the routes that where the ridership is, and you can see that reflected here on this map. But you can also see that throughout the region, we have those blue dots of ridership. Some of them are smaller, some of them are larger. I'm going to zoom in next on a closer view of the member communities we're focusing on tonight. But in general, we tend to see those pockets of ridership, outside of those busy corridors. We see pockets of ridership at commercial centers like malls, or at transfer locations where multiple routes are intersecting and people are using them to get across the region. So here I've zoomed in a little closer on Grimes, Johnston, and Urbandale, just to draw your attention. So remember I said the bigger blue dots are the more ridership. And so I'll start off maybe up in Grimes, pointing out that biggest blue dot there, that's the Grimes Walmart. We have a park and ride there. I mentioned that the Route 93 was extended there in the fall of 2019. And then in Johnston, we have Merle Hay Road, which has kind of ridership up and down the corridor there, not only at in and around City Hall, but then also as you get further north, where a lot of the housing has been built. And I think that I actually haven't looked at this over time, but I would imagine you would see that as more housing has been built around Merle Hay Road, that more ridership has followed. And I think that that's been a promising pattern, I think, for DART. As we get down into Urbandale, you can see we have some of the larger dots along Northwest 86th Street, both in Johnston and in Urbandale. Those are park and ride lots for our commuter bus, Route 93 that goes up and down Northwest 86th Street. So you see kind of pockets of ridership there. That purple zone, that is our Flex Connect zone. So that is where we have a program where if you're anywhere within that zone, you can get an Uber or a yellow cab, either through the Uber app or by calling DART customer service, and you can transfer at either the Gloria Day park and ride or down at the Buccaneer Ice Arena park and ride or at Merle Hay Mall. Merle Hay Mall, of course, being this very big dot over there. Urbandale also has this Route 74, which is serves a lot of the job sites up in the urban loop area. Sorry, I'll go back. One thing I wanted to point out about the routes, though, is that you'll notice that all of the routes really focus on north-south travel. One of the things that we have heard in the past is that there's a desire for more east-west connections. And I started to look at some of the survey data that's already been coming in just over the past week or so. And that was some of the comments that we were getting was desire for not only connections, down into West Des Moines and then further on into Des Moines, but even connections across Grimes and Johnston and Urbandale, connecting within the communities. So we've looked at that ridership data. We've looked at census data, land use data. We even looked at, you can, whether you know it or not, your cell phones track you through the apps that you use, and you can actually purchase it. It's anonymous, so we don't know who's traveling where. But we can see general travel patterns for people, and it's allowed us to kind of study how people are moving around the region. So when we look at all this data, a couple of the key trends that we see are that there's really a need for better connection between housing and jobs. As we mentioned, the number one reason that people use DART is to get to work. Yet, not all areas of our region are served equally. And so especially as we think about areas and, as jobs grow in places that don't currently have transit, or as we think about areas of our community where there are jobs and areas of their community that are more affordable to live, and getting the connection between those places. Those are some of the key trends that we want to try to address through this study. Also, I mentioned that desire for travel, not just north and south, and not just in and out of Des Moines, but across the region and between different member communities. That's when we look at driving patterns, that's how a lot of the driving patterns are. And so that indicates to us that that's how general travel demand might be. And so how can we think about how DART provides options that might be able to help people move in those similar patterns? The last thing I want to touch on is the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. I showed you some ridership data. I should have mentioned that was all pre-pandemic. Obviously we've been going through the pandemic for a year, and ridership has changed. We do think that most of the ridership patterns will resume as they were pre-pandemic, because a lot of transit ridership is based on land use and demographics, and all that stuff hasn't changed a whole lot. We do know that some things are evolving, and a couple of things that we wanted to point out was that during the pandemic we did see a ridership decrease, as there were restrictions placed on businesses that could be open. People were asked to stay home, take essential trips only. Yet even with all those restrictions and people having fear, we still saw 40% of normal ridership on weekdays. And for us, that tells us that our riders are those people with essential jobs, or our riders really do rely on us to get where they need to go. They don't have another option. And so even though when times are challenging, they're still sticking with DART. Similar story on the weekends where actually ridership wasn't impacted nearly as much, and we still saw 70% of normal ridership levels. Now, a lot of that ridership was happening on our local routes, those routes that stick on busy destinations, and the express routes that cover longer distances. Those routes, of course, did see the biggest decline in ridership because so many people were working remotely. So I want to pause there and just see, if anybody has any reactions to what I've shared so far, and any questions, comments. So I've shared with you some of the existing conditions, the opportunities and challenges as we see them. And now I'm going to talk to you about what we do with that information. When we think about planning transit routes, it's really about getting you to the destinations that you need to get to and trying to minimize your travel time. We know that people have options in a lot of cases, and that a lot of times transit can take longer. And so we really try to be efficient with that service that we provide. And so some of the strategies we take are, around, sending buses in straight lines on busy corridors versus winding around in neighborhood communities. But also we try to make sure that we're serving bus stops that are convenient, comfortable, safe, and accessible. So I mentioned some of the data analysis that we've done. This is just a more comprehensive list of all the things that we're looking at. I just kind of gave you a snapshot of this, but we've actually worked with our commission and had multiple, hours-long meetings going over some of this data to help inform the decision making. Couldn't include it all tonight, but we will have a more formal report that has a lot of that in it. Public input is also an important part of how we make decisions. We get customer requests on a regular basis. We conduct surveys. We also get a fair amount of feedback from businesses that we work with. That's especially helpful when there's a new business going in, and they help us understand what their needs will be, as well as other ways of collecting feedback. And all of this goes into the services we provide. But the service isn't black and white either. There's different types of service, as I mentioned, kind of at the top. Then we think about the hours of the day that it's offered, the frequency, where the bus stops are, even the size and type of the vehicle. And as I mentioned, those options are evolving. We do think that the fixed route buses are going to continue to be the workhorse for DART, because it's just the most efficient thing you can do is carry the most people you can on one vehicle. And that's really what a big bus is for. But we know that, when we think about 12-member communities, that the needs are different in each of those member communities. And so we want to try to be able to tailor our services to the needs of those communities and of our customers. And so some of the things that we're looking at are using smaller buses, as I mentioned before, and in particular, evolving to more on-demand services. So instead of just a bus that travels on a set route at a set time, that we have services that can be ordered and travel more door to door, similar to how an Uber or a Lyft operates. And in fact, the technology that Uber or Lyft use is actually available for transit vehicles. And it could be used on something like what we currently use for paratransit and on-call, that vehicle shown on the lower left, that can be more flexible so that people can order trips where they need to go. Now, those vehicles don't carry quite as many people, but they can go more door to door. So when you think about places that areas of town where destinations aren't all along one corridor, or where maybe the walking environment isn't as good, or where demand isn't as high, those are all areas where a more flexible service like this might make sense. We're additionally, we've piloted and looking at additional opportunities to pilot partnering with the services like Uber and Lyft and Yellow Cab to provide service directly. Sometimes that is a more efficient way than even running a bus when there's just low demand, or when that need for flexibility of route or flexibility of time of day is important. And then also our region does have a bike share program, and we have coordinated to get bike share stations at transit stops. And that is something that we're looking into to increase access to transit and increase mobility. So when we think about what some of the recommendations might look like, again, we're still crunching the data, we're collecting public input, but we know that there's going to be opportunities to improve the routes that we already have, whether it's changing the frequency of the service or serving additional areas. Those are some of the top requests that we know we get, and we have to think about, okay, within the constraints that we have, how can we serve those requests? But also and more improvements to bus stops, not only shelters and benches, which we have been doing, but also what we call a concept that we call mobility hubs, which is where you set up infrastructure so that multiple modes can come together, so that, for example, you have bike parking or bike share near the transit stop, maybe a park and ride, so people might drive to that, leave their car and get on the bus, bike lanes, things of that nature, so that we're really bringing all those options together in one place and providing more mobility for people. I mentioned some of the emerging mobility solutions. Some of the ways that we might use them are to substitute for routes that have low ridership. As I mentioned, sometimes it's just more cost effective to take individuals door to door, either on a DART vehicle or on a private service like Uber or Lyft or Yellow Cab, than running a big bus. When you just don't have a lot of people who need a ride, you don't need to always use a big bus. And so those are some of the opportunities that we see. Something we call first mile, last mile. How do we get people to the bus stop? And this is to the point I think that Paula was making, that even though we have service on some of these busier corridors in communities like Grimes, Johnston, and Urbandale, people could live, a mile away, and that's not, a reasonable walking distance for them. And so how do we get people to the bus stops? Well, some of these emerging solutions can help us do that, whether it's a short bike ride on a bike share bike, or whether it's a DART shuttle that can more flexibly maneuver around a community and bring people to a hub so that they can transfer for that longer trip. And then also just some of the other needs that we know are out there, new destinations that aren't currently served by DART. And so I'm wrapping up now. The last thing, I just wanted to reshare that timeline so you would know what to expect. We're collecting public input through meetings like this and the survey online. We'll be drafting some recommendations over the summer, and then coming back out to share those recommendations as late summer and into the fall, getting more public input before we develop a final plan by the end of the calendar year. And that now is the end of my talking. And I wanted to see if there was any more reactions to some of the ideas that I shared, especially some of those new mobility options. Do those sound like things that might be interesting and useful to folks? Any challenges you see maybe with any of those?